There is a Solution for That is sponsored by VARC Solutions. VARC Solutions helps small businesses succeed by delivering expert QuickBooks bookkeeping, consulting, quick-based development, and integrated solutions. If you own a small to medium-sized business that uses QuickBooks or QuickBase, the experts at VARC Solutions can help. In business since 1999, with people who care and the knowledge and experience to solve your toughest problems. Visit VARCSolutions.com for all your QuickBooks needs. Welcome back to another edition of There's a Solution for That, where we help small businesses succeed by discussing challenging business problems and best-in-class solutions. All right, welcome everyone to this week's podcast. We have got a special treat in store for you. We have one of our very own, Tina Atchley from VARC Solutions, who's one of our amazing QuickBooks experts, QuickBooks specialists, and we are going to be talking about how to overcome the challenges of migrating to QuickBooks Online from QuickBooks Desktop or maybe from some other software. And I know this is something that Tina is all too familiar with, so we're going to be blessed with her conversation. So Tina, maybe just give a real quick introduction on who you are and what kind of stuff you do.
Sure. So as Brad said, I am Tina Atchley, and I do bookkeeping. I do bookkeeping cleanup services. I migrate QuickBooks Desktop to QuickBooks Online, and occasionally the other way around. And I also create shell files for people who cannot do direct migrations.
Okay, and thank you for that. And we're going to dive into some of those things that especially the terminology that may not be familiar with for some people. But let's just start at the very, very beginning. When should someone who's maybe on QuickBooks Desktop, when should they consider migrating to QuickBooks Online?
So in my opinion, most of our desktop users should probably start considering that now. We have the different desktop products that seem to be going away and more online products that are being produced, and people seem to be nudged into the online world. So I think it's probably a good idea for everyone to kind of start considering the pros and the cons at this point.
Okay. Is there any time when maybe it's not a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, we have not a very robust inventory system inside of QuickBooks Online. So if you have a really robust inventory system and you are currently happy with either your advanced inventory in QuickBooks or whatever third-party inventory solution you're working with, I would just stick with it for now and see how long we have our desktop products available.
Okay, good suggestion. And I know that given that we're in the industry, we do know some of maybe the workarounds or maybe some of the solutions that kind of integrate with that. And we'll actually have a lot of those folks on the show at some point. Where maybe some of those things like inventory can be solved. But let's talk about the process and also just some of the details. So maybe one of the misconceptions I think about QuickBooks Desktop versus Online is people maybe mistakenly assume that they're exactly the same. So tell me, from your perspective, when comparing the two, maybe what are some of the big picture differences that you notice, or at least that customers call to attention after a migration?
Sure. So, as someone who trains people how to use both desktop and online, I would say they have a very different feel. For the most part, the functionality is very similar. If you're wanting to move to online, you also have the desktop app, so you can kind of keep that feel and that flow. There are some differences in the way things can be imported. There are differences in the way things can be exported. There's differences in how everything looks. And so when where do you go to work on your account details? Where do you go to create new transactions? All of that stuff is very different if you're not using the desktop app. So it can be a little scary just to look at it.
Have you had conversations with clients maybe like after a migration, maybe where they hadn't even, maybe looked at QuickBooks Online, they were just told that they should, and now they're talking to you and going, I'm lost? I mean, does that happen?
That does happen. It really does. People look at it and they get a little bit, terrified sometimes, and sometimes just a little apprehensive. So there's a full spectrum. There's some people who just jump right in and it's fine. But I think, really, if you can kind of look at how the centers work and how the different, you have your different task bars and stuff, and if you can kind of guide people into, this is where you go for all of the stuff that used to be here, and this is where you go for all of the stuff that used to be here, then people kind of see it's really not as different. It's laid out a little different, and it has a pretty look compared to what desktop has. But I think there's a lot of similarities once people start to look at how those things are laid out.
Right. So a lot of the functionality is similar, right? Maybe different terminology or naming, and as long as you
Yep.
can tell them go here instead of here, right? That kind of thing.
Yep, go here instead of here. And yes, there are things like, for example, with inventory, it's your inventory items in desktop, whereas in QuickBooks Online, it's your products and services. So, those are some things that people have to get used to. And it's not that difficult, it's just reframing everything in your mind.
Yeah, I know I've talked with people before and they've said things like, why do they keep changing the names of things and why couldn't they just leave it alone? You know, call it the same thing. But I mean, we've been in the industry for over 25 years, and we've seen a lot of that evolution, over time. And I remember when QuickBooks Online first came out, one of the things that we heard from Intuit is that they really truly looked at QuickBooks Online with a blank slate and said, we're just going to reimagine this software as if we hadn't built a desktop product in other words, to take advantage of the online platform itself, versus being maybe stuck or tied to what only happened to have worked in the desktop model. And I think part of that rethinking led to things like items, quote unquote, doesn't make sense if I'm selling a service. Like, what does that mean? And so, yeah, just simple stuff like renaming that item list to be products and services kind of makes sense. But if you're starting out from scratch with QuickBooks Online, it just makes sense. But if you're migrating, I mean, just the terminology differences can be frustrating and confusing and all those types of things. So tell me a little bit about let's get into the process a little bit because I think again, I mean, as a layman, if you will, or just someone who's doesn't know anything about QuickBooks at all, other than that's what they've used, I think it's probably easy for someone to just feel like they should just be able to click a button and go from here to here, desktop to online, and have everything magically work, and because it's still QuickBooks, right? So, what are some of the challenges that you see when doing those migrations?
So there are a number of challenges. So if you have the number of targets that will allow for a direct migration, sometimes those challenges are very few. You can kind of sort of click the button and then go in and verify, using your reporting. But sometimes you get your reports back and they don't match, and things have gone. Yeah, sometimes transactions will, for whatever reason, you'll find them, they've hit your balance sheet instead of your profit and loss. They've gone to an account that's a completely different part of their reporting. So that can be an issue. Sometimes things just don't migrate in. You'll have a certain number of customers or vendors, and some of them will just drop off. So there are some things like that can be challenging, when you're doing the direct migration, click the button migration. If you're looking at something more expensive like a shell file, then you have a whole different set of issues. So
Okay.
I know we were
Well,
going to.
and yeah, and let's talk about that because you've used the word shell file a few times, and I don't know if that's a commonly understood term or not. So how do you define or make a distinction between migrations, quote unquote, and shell files? Like, what is a shell file? What is that?
Yeah, so a migration, and people call it a lot of different things. I've heard other terms used, so this may be a little more the terminology that we use. Other companies may use different terms. But for us, a migration means we take the information that's in QuickBooks Desktop or online, and we get all of that information over into the other version, right? We We click the button, we do what we need to do to get them from point A to point B. Whereas a shell file is, for whatever reason, your click the button option doesn't work, right? Or you've tried it and it works, but all of your reporting is so far off that you don't want to bring that in. So then you create a shell file, and that means you're basically taking all of your lists and all of your open AR, open AP, uncleared checks, things like that, and you're bringing those in through lists, through imports. So, you can't really bring in a whole lot of, I said can't, you shouldn't probably bring in a whole lot of your historical data when you're doing that, because you're basically creating a clean, fresh file that doesn't have any data issues.
Okay, in the way I can kind of the way I think about that, and maybe I hope this will be helpful to the folks that are listening, is like something we can all understand right now, right? Let's say I had an iPhone 10, right? And it's got all my contacts on there. It's got all my past emails or what have you, apps and everything else. And if I just go buy a new phone and I do the cloud login or whatever that thing is, right? Depending on if you're on an Android or an iPhone, I hit the go button and I look back at the phone an hour later and everything is magically there. Like everything, all my contacts, all my history of emails, everything is there. I would describe that as a migration because I'm migrating everything from this version to this version or this file to this file or this device to that device, right? Whereas based on how you explained it, a shell file to me would be like, that phone is messed up. There's something corrupted on that phone. Uh, it's not what I want, and so why would I want to move the mess from here to there, right? Or maybe, the cloud thing doesn't work, right? There's not a cloud backup, and you just can't do it, right? So you're basically kind of like you're describing is you're buying a new phone, you're going through the fresh install, and you're filling out the basic things, but now how do you get those contacts from this phone to that phone when you've done a fresh install? I mean, is that kind of the same kind of concept that you're talking about?
That's a perfect analogy, because you have to figure out what are we going to bring in and how are we going to do it. And that's essentially when we create a shell file, we talk to our clients and what is it that we need to bring in and what is the process that we're going to use to do it.
Right. And I mean, sorry to belabor the point. It's just like I get going on one of these examples and I just keep thinking about it. Um, it's like if I had a phone with 15 years worth of contacts, do I want all 15 years of those contacts in that new phone? Probably not. I mean, there's people that I'm probably not talking to anymore. The phone's dead. I mean, all these different things. So I know that part of the consulting process for us doing a migration or a shell file is also asking, do you want all this stuff in there? Or do you only want active instead of active and inactive? So, yeah, I can imagine those things would be part of the conversation unless the client just doesn't know, and in which case, let's just bring it all in and see. Um, One of the things that I know that we hear from pretty frequently when we're talking about a migration, or let me restate that, on a shell file, is how much history am I going to bring in? Like, is there going to be any history? And so obviously, if you're doing a migration and everything goes with it, all the history's there, right? But
Right.
what's possible when it comes to a shell file in terms of the history versus, possible but very expensive?
So I would say, realistically speaking, depending on how much a client wants to spend, sure, we can export out as much data as they have available, right? But then it's a matter of getting all of that data imported and getting everything connected correctly and all of that kind of stuff. And so you're looking at how long does it take to do the imports? How long does it take to connect everything? How long does it take to verify everything? Um, so, if a client says, I really, really, really want this, it's likely that we can import what they want as long as they can get it into the correct template.
Hmm.
Um, but how time consuming is it going to be? How accurate is your data at that point? Because if they haven't cleared all of their uncleared transactions for the last 2 years, they have 3 years worth of open AR and open AP, and they're wanting to bring all of this stuff in. You're bringing in trash into a new file, for lack of better term, sorry, but you're cluttering up a brand new file that you are starting with bad data. So realistically, we can bring in a lot of data, but it's not recommended because it corrupts your file.
Good advice and good thoughts. And so what about, so we've started the conversation really framing this as a desktop QuickBooks to maybe QuickBooks Online type of conversation, but I know that's not the only conversion or migration scenario. So maybe somebody is trying to convert from a Sage or a NetSuite or Acumatica or something else, some other accounting system. How are those different than just a QuickBooks to QuickBooks?
So when you're talking about QuickBooks to QuickBooks, we know what exports out of QuickBooks because we work in QuickBooks every day. When we're working with someone who's coming out of Sage or some other product, we can give them the templates and we can say, here are the templates that need to be filled out. All of these columns are all of the data that we can import, but we're not able to really go into their file and see if, what we can export out, how we can export it out. So if they're coming from a different product, we're not really able to help them with all of the downloads and stuff like we can if they have a desktop QuickBooks file.
Right. And one of the things that I've heard from some folks is, I mean, one, like with the Sage conversion, the product is different, the features
Mm-hmm.
are different, the
Mm-hmm.
fields themselves that are being tracked in terms of data are different. And right, so like what if you've got a certain field in this other product that's been filled out, but that field doesn't even exist in QuickBooks. Now what do you do? Or if you've got, the ability to track two phone numbers in this system, but three in QuickBooks or vice versa, at some point you're going to have to manipulate that data, right? So how much time do you spend, on one of those maybe other product to QuickBooks type of migrations, like manipulating data?
So it kind of depends on how much assistance our clients are looking for. We have some clients who will say, send me the template, I'll get the information in there and I'll send you the template back. And then we have some clients who say, these are the reports that we can report out in Excel. Can you help me get this into the template? And we can certainly do that. It is time consuming because we're not comparing apples to apples. And so we're having to go, okay, what field would this correlate to? And then we're having to, just play around with the spreadsheet a lot. So it's really beneficial if the clients will take a look at the templates that we send them and see what information is really crucial that they get into their system. Because sometimes, they'll send us the template back and they'll say, well, we'll take care of the template. They send the template back, we do the import, we send them the shell file, and they say, well, it doesn't have, X, Y, or Z data in it. And I look at the template and I go, well, the template doesn't have X, Y, or Z data in it.
Right.
And I import what isn't there. So, I mean,
You can't just magically make data appear? Come on,
no,
Tina.
I can't just magically make serial numbers and all that fun stuff just appear. No, I wish I could.
That is funny. Well, I imagine in this line of work, since I know you're doing these types of migrations all the time, you've got to be a master of Excel, probably, right, at some level. So maybe talk about some of the tools. I mean, I know, you're not hand keying all this data. So what are some of the tools that you are familiar with using in these types of migrations or shell files that can kind of speed up the work if somebody's maybe trying to do it themselves?
Sure. So if they're trying to do it themselves, one thing they can do if they're coming out of desktop from QuickBooks, not a different product, they can export out their IIF files and they can open those files, which would be their lists and things like that. They can open those in Excel and then they can manipulate those in Excel. Or if they want our assistance, they can send those IIF files to us and we can get them into the correct template. So exporting of IIF files for desktop is one way that they can export out their information. Typically, we are using either a third-party software called TheresaSolutionforThat, or we're using our QBO import tools, which now there are more and more being created for QuickBooks Online. A few months ago, there were, maybe 4 different things that you could import. And now there's a whole list. You can import invoices, you can import bills, you can import journal entries, which before, was not really an option. So you can use the QuickBooks templates or the QuickBooks Online templates, or you can use the SANT. There's a lot more information that can be imported with a third-party software.
Okay, perfect. And just for clarity, for everybody who's listening in, they're like, "What? What did she say?" We'll in the show notes, we'll put some of those details so that you can either link to that or get to that. But Tina, I think one of the things you were mentioning was IIF files. That's the whole in QuickBooks Desktop file utilities export. IIF right around there. Um, and that's the native Intuit interchange format from 25 years ago. And yeah, that's it can be a little weird to look at, especially like in a notepad, but Excel can sort of manipulate that. Um, and then the other tool you were talking about was Sasant. Sasant, I've heard 3 different ways to say it, but Sasant, SAASANT.
Correct.
um, Great tool. I know some people have used Transaction Pro Importer, Transaction Pro Exporter, those types of tools, depending on what you're going from and to, can be very, very helpful. And I think just a general understanding of Excel probably is pretty good, especially if you
Yeah.
need to manipulate data, truncate, get rid of things, move things around. Um,
Right.
so great suggestions for that. So let's talk about maybe some of the challenges. And when I say challenges, I really mean more like things that are common problems with a migration. And by the way, let's be humble and also admit some of the mistakes. I know even though we've done lots and lots of these, and you in particular have done lots and lots of these, sometimes we make mistakes, right? And we've got to learn from those things. So I say that because if somebody is trying to do it themselves, I want them to maybe learn from our experience, maybe avoid some of the mistakes that we might have made early on. What are some of those problem areas that people get into with migrations and or some of those easy mistakes to make that if they just did this or this, those problems go away?
Sure. So one thing that I've seen is people will take all of their data, they'll put it all into a template, and they'll try to import it all at once, and then nothing goes where they want it to go, and they've got 10,000 of something to correct. So I would always, for me, I will go in and I will import 3 to 5 of something to see, is it coming in the way I want it to come in? Um, if it's not, what can I do to fix it? Before you do those large imports, some clients have 15, 20,000 customers. Um,
Hmm.
Same thing with vendors. If they're not active, I wouldn't bring them in. But if they choose to, then I would go in and I would do a small scale import for the first go around to make sure everything is coming in properly. So
That
that's a big tip.
that's brilliant. I mean, it makes so much sense, but maybe not so obvious, right? That you can even do that, or maybe that you could take a big file and break it into chunks and do a little test import. That's actually really, really brilliant. Yeah, because I assume just with especially with any type of import from anything to something, right? There's going to be some sort of a mapping process, right? Where you're
Always.
mapping a field to a column on a spreadsheet, and I imagine that's easy to get wrong.
It is. It can be easy to get wrong. It can also, you can find things that work a little differently than you expect. So when I first started using Sasant for QBO, because I've been using it for desktop for a while, but not for QuickBooks Online, I realized that in the names, if you use the Sasant import tool, it will break, if there's not a first and last name for the contact for the business, it will break up the name of the business into multiple lines. And then when you see your shipping or your billing address, it's going to have the name twice because it has the actual business name, and then it wants to give it a contact name. So, if you're doing those kinds of imports, I would go in and use now that QBO has its own vendor and customer imports, well, then they've had them for a while. But I would use those where possible, just because you can avoid things like it forcing that name.
Okay, makes perfect sense. But so I think the word there is just trial and error, right? Just like try a little bit, see how it works, go look at it and go maybe run some reports and see if it matches or see if it gives you what you're expecting, right? And if it doesn't, you might want to figure out what went wrong or maybe what didn't get put in the right place. So great suggestions. So as we get close to wrapping up here, any other tips and tricks that you would suggest for somebody that might be doing this on their own?
Sure. So I guess maybe it's not even necessarily a tip or a trick, just some general guidance.
Yep.
When you're getting ready to either migrate or create a shell file, make sure you do those things like reading the Intuit guidance that tells you what does or does not migrate. What is different? It'll tell you can look at their guidance and see what are the names in desktop and what are the names used in QuickBooks Online. So you can kind of prepare yourself that way. Also, keeping your file up to date. If you're migrating a file that hasn't been reconciled in 2 years, you have no idea if you're migrating good data, right? So making sure you're doing those general upkeep and maintenance things, keeping your AR and your AP corrected. And then if you have a lot of open AR and open AP and you have enterprise, you have accountant tools that you can use to match payments and things like that a lot of people aren't aware of if it's not something that they've used before. So definitely doing things like just that upkeep. And also keeping an eye on your targets, because if you go into your file and you hit the F2 key, you're going to see all of the information about your file. And once the targets reach 750,000, you can no longer do a direct migration.
Mm.
So if it's something that you're considering, go into your QuickBooks, open it up, hit F2, and if you're approaching that number, that you need to seriously start considering what your next step should be before you're over that limit, and then you don't really have a choice and you're forced into a shell file.
Well,
Um,
yeah, that's good. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry.
no, go ahead.
Okay, so targets. Again, I try to put myself in the place of somebody who doesn't know anything about anything. Um, what in the heck is a target? Or is that just like some sort of derivative of file size or something like that?
It's not file size. So a lot of people will try to do things to get their file size down, thinking if they get their file size reduced, they can do the direct migration. But it is strictly based off of that target as to whether or not it will migrate. And if it's over 750, and from my understanding, after reading multiple times to verify, a target is basically a line of information. So if you have, that's simplifying it, but that's essentially what it is. And if you have, 750,000 of those, there are too many and it doesn't work properly. So, that's
Yeah, so
that's
basically
one.
like if you had 7,500 invoices and each one of those had 10 line items, if I'm doing the math, or maybe it's 100 line items, whatever that math is, that could in
Right.
fact just that could be 750,000 targets, and now we're like at this point where it just won't work.
Right. And I
Okay.
mean, again, what is Intuit consider a line of information? I'm not really sure.
Okay.
I see line of information and, line of data, I think is how it's worded.
Okay.
So I just, if you go in and you see that number's creeping up and you're getting closer and closer to that 700, 750 mark, you really need to start considering what your next step should be.
Well, I know that we are the ones that get those types of calls when they've tried it, right? Or they've hit the button, they've hit the magic button, and it's
Mm-hmm.
either stalled or stopped working or just said, "Sorry, can't do it." I know we get those calls because people are frustrated and they're like, I thought this was going to be super easy. Now I'm finding out it's not so easy." And yeah, you hit the F2 button and you're like, yeah, you've been using this file for 15 years. It's a 5 GB file and you've got 2 million targets, whatever that number is. Are there anything that a user could do to get the targets down, so that they still can do the migration?
There is nothing on my end that I can do. And I've not seen any guidance from Intuit that says that they can reduce targets. So, to my knowledge, there is not. That is, when you have them, and they're just there. So you
Kind of
can
like kind of
reduce the
like
fine.
kids. Once you have them,
Yes,
you're stuck with them,
yes.
right?
So you're stuck with them. Yes.
Well, I know like people have heard, if you've been in the desktop QuickBooks world long enough, you will at some point have heard the words archive and condense. And I know from our company's perspective, archiving and condensing is a dirty word. Um, but so why is that? Like, I mean, if somebody said, "Oh, I'll just archive and condense," why is that maybe a bad thing to do?
I mean, you lose data, and if your whole point is to migrate all of your data, you can create, you know, data errors and stuff when you do those condensed. Same thing with, we're just going to get rid of the whole audit trail. Okay, but if you ever have to go back and find out when or what happened, you can't. So, anytime you mess with your file, you can cause other problems. So you just have to be aware that when you go in to do those things, you can cause other problems that you weren't considering. So
Okay, so
definitely read up on everything, all of the guidance that's out there from Intuit, and make an informed decision before you take that leap. Don't do it and then, oh my gosh, what have I done?
right. And I guess the best advice at this point would be make sure that you do a backup. I mean, it's probably going to make you do a backup anyways, but do your own
Right.
backup before you do anything to that file, just in case it's a mess.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, so my last question for you is, again, given that you've done many, many, many of these, you know the problems, you know the challenges, and in fact, a lot of the experience that we've gained through that process of doing these migrations all the time is an ebook, right? We put an ebook on our website, the ultimate guide to migrating from QuickBooks Desktop to online, and we've tried to take some of those tidbits that you've talked about, some of the things that don't migrate, whether it's inventory or payroll or multi-currency. I mean, all those kind of things. So if somebody's looking for a guidebook, searching the Intuit Help World could work, right? But we've kind of tried to take all of that stuff and really boil it down into the essentials that you need to know. So that is a resource that is on our website if you need to take a look at that at VARCSolutions.com. Now, sorry, with that little commercial, Tina, since you've done a lot of these, I mean, is this something you would like if you were talking to your best friend that had a business that had QuickBooks Desktop and they were looking to migrate, would you suggest that they try it, or would you be more like, hey, look, let's leave this to the experts?
Here are some things that I would consider before. I would ask my friend first, obviously, look at your targets. That's going to be your indicator. Can you do it or not? The second is, do you have complex inventory? If you have complex inventory and you're happy with it, don't do it. Just wait. Wait and see what happens. The other thing is, if you are going to take the time to look at the resources that are available, sure, go ahead and try it. You run your series of reports out of your desktop and you do the migration yourself following the Intuit guidance and their migration tool. And then afterwards, you run all of those same exact reports for the same exact date in your online product. And then if it works, it works. If not, worst case scenario, you cancel that QBO, you get another one, and you start over. But you can try it, absolutely. Just make sure you're doing all of your validations using your reporting. Otherwise, just because you get that little message from Intuit that says congratulations and it's a successful migration, when you start looking at the reporting, you're like, wait a minute, how is this successful? So, always make sure you're doing your own reporting for validation.
Okay. So great advice. And I guess what one of the positive takeaways from what you just said is, I think people have a fear of doing something wrong, right? They have a fear of messing something up. And I just think like of my dad, and sitting in front of a computer and there's like an OK button and that's the only button on the screen and he's worried about touching it. He's worried about clicking it and he's like, "Should I click it?" I said, "It's the only button you can click. Go ahead and click it. It's going to be fine." Is for somebody who's nervous about this, it's not an unrecoverable situation, right? If they try it on their own and it doesn't give them the right, output on the QuickBooks Online file, it's not the end of the world, right? They can start over. They can try it again, and if it's just not working, they can call a company like ours to give them that expert guidance so that we can help them do it well or right or fix the issues, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Now,
Okay.
once you try it, you if it doesn't work, you can come to us.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, hey, Tina, this has been a breath of fresh air. I really enjoyed talking to you and like getting some of that stuff out of your brain that you just do on autopilot, I'm sure, because you've done it so many times. So thank you for joining the show and sharing your wisdom with the world.
Thank you, Brad.
Awesome, awesome. Well, for those of you that are listening in, hope you enjoyed this. Again, hope you always got really good content and thought-provoking insights from this episode. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. There is a Solution for That is produced by VARC Solutions. This episode was produced by Ashley White and Aaron Riley. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Watch the video version on youtube.com/theresaSolutionforThat or visit VARCSolutions.com/podcast where you'll find our entire podcast archive, as well as show notes, links to solution providers, and complete transcripts of every episode. If you love the podcast, please leave a review with your comments.